So, why some Bitcoin devs say lasers can cut mining's energy cost. For Mining Week on CoinDesk, like I said, we're going to be covering at least one article from Mining Week on CoinDesk a day this week. Optical proof of work could improve geographic distribution of hash rate and quell fears of climate-related pushback, proponents argue. Bitcoin's energy use has long been a hot button issue. Now, some developers say the solution could lie in a more energy efficient form of computer processing that perhaps appropriately uses lasers. When we consider Bitcoin energy use, really the discussion should focus on emissions. That's what they say. I don't think it should focus on emissions. I think it should focus on energy waste, but that's because I'm in Texas and I'm really infatuated with flare gas and not wasting, just burning 20% of it off into the atmosphere as opposed to utilizing it. I don't know. I think there's an argument there. That's just how I feel about it, but I'd rather start reducing energy waste at first because that's the most simple thing to do, and then we can go from there, boys. But, it's not how a lot of people think. Industry participants have worked towards improving transparency in that category the past couple of years. If we look even further back, Hal Finney, who received the first Bitcoin transaction ever from the system's creator Satoshi Nakamoto, said he was thinking about how to reduce CO2 emissions from a widespread Bitcoin implementation in 2009. Most arguments about remediating Bitcoin's emission problems center around outright banning it, cleaning up its energy mix, or switching from proof of work to a consensus mechanism that doesn't require a heavy use of electricity to work, typically proof of stake, a transition Ethereum has been planning to carry out since 2015. All right. That won't happen because miners control the governance. Just FYI for anybody that's worried about that statement. I'm just going to say that and then we're going to move on. Rarely discussed is the possibility of change to a different type of proof of work. Bitcoin Optical, a working group of developers that produce free education materials, pointed out in its January 5th, 2022 newsletter that Bitcoin Improvement Proposal 52 was officially brought into the discussion for a proposed hard fork or major change to Bitcoin. BIP 52 aspires to shift expenses from electricity costs to operating expenses to hardware costs or capital expenditures. This shift will be achieved through what is known as optical proof of work, or OPOW, a proposal created by Michael Dabrowski, Bogdan Penkovsky, both contributors to nonprofit Proof of Work X and an assistant professor at New York University's Corin Institute of Mathematical Sciences. In short, OPOW would change the proof of work algorithm used by Bitcoin now to one dubbed heavy hash that is mostly computed using a new class of photonic processors. It's not just photonic processors. Are they just stealing that name? There's a couple coins that are heavy hash right now, by the way, boys. Heavy hash is the algorithm is the name of the algorithm that Caspa uses. The motivation behind this proof of work is to decouple Bitcoin mining from energy and make it feasible outside of regions with low electricity costs. This shift, proponents argue, would improve geographic distribution of computing power or hash rate, decrease barriers to entry for new miners, and quell any fears of climate-related pushback as Bitcoin proliferates and grows in popularity, since the switch would reduce Bitcoin's energy and demand. It is worth mentioning before we go further that optical proof of work is still not fully developed and has not been used in practice in a Bitcoin testnet or an experimental environment for software changes. There's a live implementation of optical proof of work called OBTC. There's also another one called, so this is what it gets a little confusing. So technically there's a modified version of it as well running on Caspa, which is part of the big deal here, just to give you guys an idea. So, yeah, okay. which is based on the optical proof of work modified Bitcoin code base published by Proof of Work X in March of 2021. It is not actively marketed or managed by Optical Proof of Work's creators, but there is a community of supporters who mine and trade OBTC. Additionally, Proof of Work X is collaborating with optical computing companies, including Lightelligence, to explore commercialization of an optical proof of work miner and is testing heavy hash on a demo platform. Why optical proof of work mining might work. There are many benefits of Bitcoin's energy-intensive construction, namely robustness and anti-fragility, for example. That said, just because proof of work has worked so well throughout Bitcoin's history does not mean that other ideas should be dismissed on sight. Bitcoin is a technology and technology changes. Yeah, but you can change the hardware and not change the software, which I think is something that a lot of people miss when we start discussing proof of work and its energy consumption, which is just get the hardware more efficient, which it's already in the natural progression of doing because people are incentivized to make the hardware more efficient. Because the more efficient you make it, the more money you make. So it's kind of like weird that people are completely ignoring the incentives that are already built into Bitcoin surrounding power consumption and energy usage, which is essentially just everybody is incentivized to reduce their power consumption, make it more renewable, and be able to mine it better and faster and more efficiently than the guy that's next door, right? That's the entire point of it. So it's already going to move in that direction. I don't think you need to change the software necessarily. That being said, as far as optical proof of work goes, and as far as heavy hash goes, which is kind of weird that they're proposing it for this, I do think that Caspa is a very interesting project as well as OBTC. First and foremost, lasers have shown promise in making computation more efficient. Photons enable a higher bandwidth than electrons when used in computers, which is why fiber internet powered by flashing lights through glass cables is faster than regular internet. While there is some disagreement about feasibility of laser-based computers replacing semiconductor-based ones outright, optical computation could theoretically improve performance. Not to mention it fits the laser eyes meme popular among Bitcoiners. Ha ha ha. From a business perspective, optical proof of work makes a lot of sense. Instead of having capital expenditure and operating expenses taking an equal share in running Bitcoin mine, the coin shifts towards upfront investment. As a result, optical proof of work Bitcoin hardware would be markedly more expensive than current machines. That investment could be more easily financed as lenders would have expensive equipment to collateralize against, and the cost of operations would be predictable because miners would be less sensitive to changes in energy availability and pricing. As such, cash flow pressures would be further eased as pricier equipment allows companies to run additional depreciation expenses through their financial statements, an accounting trick in practice that nonetheless has real financial consequences. See, part of the problem here, though, is it's going in the wrong direction. If we really want to get into it, if we want to incentivize the entire population to reduce energy consumption, be more conscious of it, and all that sort of thing, you would say that you would want to actually get the hardware to be cheaper. You would want it to be mineable on consumer grade products, and you would want to educate the population on basically responsible use and mining and all that sort of stuff, right? As opposed to okay, now it's just going to be one big expensive piece of equipment that some large massive company owns, and then you just go the wrong direction. I think a lot of people already see this with ASICs as being the problem too. I do want to say before we go further too as well, just to ease everybody's mind, that this is 99.9% probably improbable or impossible due to the fact that, once again, the governance surrounding Bitcoin comes from the miners. And because of that, I just don't see miners voting themselves out of a job, which is essentially what they would be doing to pass an EIP like this. Additionally, if technology worked, it would make energy a less important piece of Bitcoin's composition. Notwithstanding the genuine benefits of an energy-intensive blockchain, a shift away from energy consumption would unquestionably ease political pressures, especially in the United States and the European Union, where a regulator has called for a ban on proof-of-work crypto mining, and the parliament seriously considered such a draconian measures, though ultimately rejected them. In this scenario, politicians and regulators might conceivably warm to Bitcoin if one of their major points of contention were to fall away. Proponents of optical proof of work also argue the shift away from energy dependency would improve the geographic distribution of Bitcoin mining, since it would no longer be concentrated in places with cheap, abundant energy. Instead, it would be mined wherever capital is available to be put to work to mine Bitcoin, which is the same that we don't want that. That's the same problem that proof of stake has, really, at the end of the day, right? This would make Bitcoin less susceptible to aggressive swings in hash rate if, say, a coal mine explodes in China or a Kazakh government shuts down the internet. That being said, of course, that hasn't really impacted Bitcoin hash rate as much as they would like you to think, because it's only been about total of 2% drop in difficulty on the network, and maybe like the same amount of hash rate, somewhere around there, with Kazakh all the way shutting down. Another argument of optical proof of work proponents make it that the main source of Bitcoin's network security comes from game theory as opposed to its energy use. The idea here is that Bitcoin miners are compelled to be good actors, otherwise their mining equipment in Bitcoin would become worthless if such a successful attack on the network were carried out. Right now, it's particularly impossible to rent enough machines to control 51% of Bitcoin hash rate in order to attack the network. So an attacker would have to be a large owner of mining assets. With that in mind, shifting even more of the cost of mining to capital expenditure would increase the overall security of the system. I would disagree. Lastly, a hard fork or backward incompatible code change is not necessarily required for the Bitcoin network to test and eventually implement optical proof of work. It's theoretically possible to add optical proof of work to Bitcoin as a soft fork, one that would allow users to run the old version without causing a split in the network. This is a potentially important point, as hard fork proposals have historically been highly contentious among Bitcoiners. The most famous example is the Bitcoin Cash hard fork that stemmed from the virulent debate over block size and block capacity enhancement of segregated witness in 2017. In a soft fork test phase, miners could ensure that most mining revenue would be earned using the current mining algorithm and a small percentage using optical proof of work. This could create sufficient incentive for optical proof of work to be stress tested and to incentivize the manufacture of dedicated optical proof of work miners. If this test phase were successful, the breakdown could be adjusted over time such that optical proof of work accounts for up to 100% of Bitcoin's mining activity. If unsuccessful, it could be phased out. All right, so it says why it might not work. There are several arguments for why it would not work. In the early days of Bitcoin mining, we saw China dominate, owning to its glut of cheap energy. That cheap, abundant energy was a result of China looking to aggressively expand its economy and become energy independent. In doing so, China overbuilt its power generation capacity. Bitcoin mining ended up coalescing within China because China fulfilled Bitcoin's miners' needs for cheap input costs to keep operating expenses down. Simply shifting the cost curve to upfront costs might lead the exact opposite centralization problem. Instead of most Bitcoin mining ending up near cheap, abundant energy sources that popped up in developing labor-abundant countries like China, they might coalesce in developed capital-abundant countries like the United States. But that's already happening without that. Like, we already see that. Everything's moving over here because China banned it, right? So, imagine if they were more expensive, requiring immense amounts of startup capital would have a meaningful impact on the feasibility of solo mining, which would itself be a blow to decentralization. Next, optical proof of work may not work in practice. It's still a theory, and although it has been put through the ringer, that is the developer brain trust, no one knows how optical proof of work will behave and work when real people start using it and their money is at stake. Just like the lack of commercially successful implementations of proof of stake, optical proof of work is untested, particularly in Bitcoin. There's no guarantee that it will be secure enough for Bitcoin, and some of the comments on the BIP GitHub repository say as much. Developer Jeremy Rubin pointed out a potential design flaw that could give some miners an unfair advantage over the rest if it was exploited. As mentioned above, Proof of Work X has launched on OBTC, a Bitcoin lookalike that implements optical proof of work. But even if OBTC is successful within its own ecosystem, that doesn't necessarily mean it would be successful in the context of Bitcoin itself. Yeah, and I think you just need to spin up different blockchains, right? Like, go ahead and spin up Caspo, test it out, see how it functions there as far as the heavy hash goes, spin up the OBTC if you want, see how it functions there. It has to be proven and put through the fire at those levels before you could ever even consider moving it to basically the big daddy, right? Lastly, and mostly, optical proof of work would fundamentally change the way Bitcoin interacts with the rest of the world. Energy is an important part of Bitcoin now, and as Bitcoin grows, it will become a more important part of the energy system. On top of that, while capital is put to work in proof of work or proof of stake systems, more of it would be invested up front in an optical proof of work system. That capital could be put to work elsewhere. And that capital is far more easily moved than energy. Given the technological cap on our ability to transport energy, a bank wire transfer may seem slow, but you have tried building an oil pipeline. Potentially more wasteful to tie up capital in a proof of stake or similar system. Capital can be used almost anywhere on countless ideas for projects. The energy used by a proof of work system, on the other hand, can't be used as freely as capital. Removing the energy intensive component from Bitcoin could fundamentally change what it has become and what it may become. And I think it would change it for the worse personally. What's next for Bitcoin and optical proof of work? Optical proof of work remains one of more than 150 Bitcoin improvement proposals being discussed by developers. To receive a BIP number and be added to the repository, a proposal simply must follow the correct format and be technically possible to do so. It doesn't need broad support or even be generally a good idea. Although optical proof of work may have been implemented as a hard fork, that's not to say that the update would be dead on arrival. We don't know what improvements can be made to the proposal, and we don't know where Bitcoin will be tomorrow. So keep your laser eyes on this fascinating, if debatable, idea. And I think what will happen is we'll just see it put into different currencies and kind of test it out there. Here's some things that I think a lot of people once again completely ignore the fact that the governance is run by the miners, have to get voted in by the miners. With all the capital invested within Bitcoin mining surrounding ASICs, something drastic would have to happen to the Bitcoin network for everybody to just go ahead and vote for a new consensus mechanism. And I don't see it happening anytime soon. So that's kind of where I sit as far as that goes. Now let's talk about a little bit of upfront capital investment, which to me sounds like also less equipment to work with and so on. It's more similar to proof of stake than proof of work if we're talking about the way the money is invested and what that means for it. Because one of the arguments I saw in my comment section regarding proof of stake, proof of work was that proof of stake and proof of work are no different because Jeff Bezos, if he wanted to, could invest just as much in proof of work equipment and therefore just take over the network that way. And because he has more money, it's the same problem with proof of stake. The key difference here that you need to take into account when you hear these types of arguments, right, is that proof of work requires infrastructure. So because it requires infrastructure and because it requires power, it basically is a job generating venture. And whether that's the electrician or the electricity company or your network engineers or whatever, for Jeff Bezos to scale a massive infrastructure to invest in Bitcoin more than any of us, he would have to have employees. Whereas with proof of stake, all he has to have is a single VPS, a single server running in the cloud, and the most amount of money to invest into it. And it kind of sits off and does its own thing. The important part of society and the economy, a society's economy, right, that a lot of people seem to always forget about is that is directly related to how much energy that society can basically utilize. And the more efficient a society gets at utilizing that energy, and the more of that energy they use, the more successful traditionally those societies will be. So Bitcoin can be a huge pump to any economy that decides to participate in it because of its power consumption, which could be a positive thing for a lot of the smaller countries. That's why I think you see that shift into it. I hope you enjoyed this clip from the Crypto Mining Morning Show every Monday through Friday, 7:45 a.m. Pacific and 10:45 a.m. Eastern Time. You can check out more clips here, or if you're interested in checking out the entire live show, you can check that out down here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Tuesday.